Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to see all of you here with us this evening. Welcome to the 2018 Book Awards dinner. We're delighted to be at the Carnegie Institution for Science this evening to celebrate 3 wonderful books. Before we begin the program, I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the members of the 2018-2021 Phi Beta Kappa Committee on Awards who are attending this evening, and thank them for their service to Phi Beta Kappa. Chair Christine Cano, Senators at Large John Pope and Kathleen McGarry. I also want to thank Phi Beta Kappa Awards Coordinator Jen Horniman and Associate Secretary Eva Caldera for their work on the Book Awards. It really is one of my favorite nights of the year, and I'm always mindful of how much work goes into the selection process. It's now my pleasure to introduce Phi Beta Kappa Secretary Fred M. Lawrence. I've known Fred for years, since we were both presidents in Massachusetts, working through ACUM, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in Massachusetts. And I couldn't be more delighted to be working alongside him, advancing the agenda for Phi Beta Kappa. For the last 2 years since becoming CEO and secretary of the society, Fred has traveled around the country, invigorating our chapters and associations, advocating for the arts, humanities, and sciences on Capitol Hill. And he's continued his own scholarship on the freedom of expression on campuses. When I first met Fred, he immediately struck me as a person of integrity and honor. But what I valued most was his willingness to mentor colleagues in the complex job of what it takes to be a successful college president today. He continues to serve as a mentor and friend in our roles as presidents of associations. And I just couldn't be more grateful to him for all that he does in advancing the work of Phi Beta Kappa. So without further ado, Secretary Fred Lawrence.
Thank you, Lynn. There is a special bond between people who've been university presidents. There are a number in the room. This isn't in the script, but it does remind me of the story. It does remind me of the story of the university president who got a call from the editor of the student paper, said, "I want to shadow you for a day." And he said, "Well, you're free to do that, but it's really not a very good day that you chose, because it's a day that I'm actually taking off. It's the first day I've taken off in a year. I'm not going to be on campus at all, and I'm just going to relax and kick back." And the student reporter said, "That's fine. Well, if you don't mind my following you, I'll just follow you, and we'll see what you do when you take a day off." So among other things, this president was a devoted fisherman. And so he says, "We're going to go out and do some fishing." Young reporter says, "That's fine, I'll do that." So they row out into the middle of the lake, and as they're in the middle of the lake, the president says, "Shoot, I forgot my bait." And the kid says, "Well, I guess we'll just have to row back." He says, "It's all right." The president gets out of the boat, walks across the water, gets his bait out of his tackle box, walks back across the water, gets in the boat, and commences fishing. Next day, a headline in the student paper says, "President of the university can't swim." Now, there are 2 kinds of people in the room. There are those of you who haven't been presidents who think that story is funny, and then there's the rest of us. This is, as Lynn said, really one of the great nights of the year for Phi Beta Kappa. If I may just first take a couple of points of personal privilege. Could I ask my wonderful team from 1606 New Hampshire Avenue, the national headquarters of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, please stand and be recognized. No one gets to come to work every day with a more dedicated staff than I get to share my headquarters with. So thank you all for what you do for Phi Beta Kappa, for our mission, for our cause. Could I also ask my colleagues on the Phi Beta Kappa Senate to please stand and be recognized? Thank you all for what you do to advance the cause of the liberal arts and sciences. Now, this is the point when you all expect me to say now more than ever, I know. But I have to say that I'm going to switch it up on you a little bit tonight. I don't think I'm going to stop saying now more than ever, but tonight I'm thinking not now more than ever, but actually something a little different. I'm thinking always relevant. And I'll tell you what makes me think always relevant. I want to read you a remarkable statement from nearly 100 years ago, one of Lynn's predecessors, the president of Phi Beta Kappa in 1919, a man named Edward Burge, who was the president of University of Wisconsin-Madison. Actually, at the new senator orientation, I read the first paragraph of this, but for the new senators who think they've heard it all, you haven't heard the punchline yet. Listen to how President Burge, president of Phi Beta Kappa, president of University of Wisconsin-Madison, defined first the mission of Phi Beta Kappa and then the future of Phi Beta Kappa. Here's what he said. The fundamental faith of Phi Beta Kappa is in its inexhaustible value of the accumulated experience of the human race as a guide to wise action in all relations of life. This experience is developed in science, recorded in history, embodied in literature. All permanent social gains flow out of it, are based upon it. All leadership which promises secure advance rests with those to whom the worth of the past is as clear as is the vision of the future. But now listen to the turn he makes, which is why I say always relevant. But this faith, he said, is no mere conservative force limiting progress and controlling its advance. This is 1919. He had just watched the world fall apart the prior 5 years, and he's thinking about the role of the liberal arts. We believe in our motto, he said. We cognize philosophy as the pilot of life, not concerned to keep the ship in harbor, but to guide it safely through dangerous waters. The problem, therefore, for us today, both as individuals and as a society, is to make our faith active and effective in the changing world around us. That's 100 years ago, and honest to God, it could have been written last night. So now more than ever, maybe, but always relevant. And when he talks about the experience developed in science, recorded in history, and embodied in literature, well, that just happens to be our 3 book awards tonight. So let me begin first with the Christian Gauss Award. Christian Gauss Award is the oldest of the 3 Phi Beta Kappa book awards. It was established by the Phi Beta Kappa Senate back in 1950 to recognize outstanding books in the field of literary scholarship or criticism. Was named for the late Christian Gauss, the distinguished Princeton University scholar, teacher, and dean, who also served as a Phi Beta Kappa senator himself, and from 1946 to 1949 was the president of the Phi Beta Kappa Society. The winning title of the Phi Beta Kappa Christian Gauss Award this year is Henry David Thoreau, A Life by Laura Dassow Walls, published by the University of Chicago Press. Thoreau was born, I was going to say 200 years ago, 201 years ago. 200 years ago when the book came out, 201 years ago now, on July 12th. And it's not just that I'm an idiot savant, that happens to be my birthday. Thoreau speaks to each new generation. We find ourselves in his stories and in his writings, from Civil Disobedience to The Maine Woods to The Timeless Walden. In part philosopher, scientist, writer, environmentalist, he retains a remarkable freshness. How many of us here can remember the first time we read the opening words of Walden? When I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house that I had built for myself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and I earned my living by the labor of my hands only. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. At present, I am a sojourner in civilized life again. And we were hooked. Laura Walls set for herself the task to bring Thoreau alive in this generation, and she has done so, painting a complete portrait of Thoreau, weaving the various strands of his life together to produce a living Thoreau, a Thoreau for our times, from his times, and again now in ours. Dr. Laura Walls is the William P. and Hazel B. White Professor of English at the University of Notre Dame. Her book, The Passage to Cosmos, earned the Merrill Curti Award for Intellectual History by the Organization of American Historians, the James Russell Lowell Prize for Literary Studies by the Modern Language Association, and the Kendricks Prize for Literature and Science by the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts. Her work has been supported by the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, ACLS, among others, and now it is a great pleasure to add to that impressive list of accomplishments the 2008 Christian Gauss Award to Dr. Laura Walls.
So this is a great honor and a great privilege. Thank you. So I wanted to say something about Thoreau to all of you, and I thought I would lead by telling a little story, and this won't take too long. I know we're all anxious to move forward on the program and get to dinner. Believe me, I can talk for many hours on this. On the morning of February 15th, 1851, Henry David Thoreau woke up to learn that during the night, his neighbors had housed one Shadrach Minkins, an escaping slave who was fleeing for his life from the federal authorities. And they had helped him move toward freedom and safety in Canada. Typically, Thoreau, on learning this, was both furious and jubilant. "What is it to be free from King George?" he stormed in his journal, "and remain the slave of prejudice. What is the value of any political freedom but as a means of moral freedom?" Well, in the last couple of years, more people than I can count have remarked to me that, and we didn't coordinate on this, we need Thoreau more now than ever. So this quote suggests why. Thoreau is the great American scold. He's impatient with our faults and our weaknesses. He's furious with our failures to live up to our ideals. Scorning convention, disrespecting fences and walls, demanding that we actually live by the democratic beliefs we profess. Some know him today as a political writer, the author of Civil Disobedience and of those scorching protests against slavery. Others know him as a nature writer, the poet of New England's fields and woods and rivers. But Thoreau would tell us that dividing these two, the political from the natural, the literary from the scientific, is the deepest prejudice of all, for it divides us from all life, not our own, life that we think we can seize for ourselves and for our purposes. He tried to make his own life a standing refutation against that prejudice by speaking for nature, as he said, since everyone else seemed to be speaking only for civilization, but also by speaking for civilization, that is, for true civilization, which, as he was certain, meant refusing to commit any act of injustice against any other living being, human or natural. For are we not all each other's neighbors? Is not the way we choose to live always creating the environment for all life? This is what he went to Walden to explore through building a house, also through reading, through walking, through talking with friends who came to visit. through living and through writing, not to isolate himself, but to disclose to himself and thence to us the extent of all our connections. For as he also said in Walden, what is the use of a house without a tolerable planet to put it on? Today, we need more than ever to find and foster our connections, for we are more than ever in danger of losing both our democracy and our tolerable planet. Here I take hope, again, from Thoreau, who also, my final quote here, wrote, and this is also in Walden, "Not till we are lost, not till we have lost the world, do we begin to find ourselves, to realize where we are and the infinite extent of our relations." So tonight I want to thank Thoreau for having been such a prickly and demanding intellectual partner, so prickly and demanding that I was provoked into spending much of my life in his company. I'd also like to thank my real-life partner, Bob Wallace, who couldn't be with us tonight, for his unstinting and stalwart support. And I will say, beware of marrying a writer. We are obsessive. I want to thank my parents, my mom, who was a proud Phi Beta Kappa member. I'm wearing the pin that she gave me when I was inducted. And also my father, a scientist, who is an equally proud member of Sigma Xi, and I'm wearing his pin as well, for teaching me that the human and natural worlds are always integral to each other, and that science and literature and scholarship are what make life worth living. Which is to say, to thank all of you here tonight for sharing that belief, and above all to Phi Beta Kappa for recognizing this book with the Christian Gauss Award, and for gathering us all together tonight to celebrate all that makes life worth living in common together. Thank you.
The Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science was established in 1959 to encourage literate and scholarly interpretations of the physical and biological sciences and mathematics. The winning title this year for the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science is Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Our Worst by Robert Sapolsky, published by Penguin Press. In his review of Behave in the New York Times, biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham aptly noted that this is the book, quote, "you'll wish you had in college," unquote. Sapolsky draws on neurobiology, social psychology, ethics, and various other disciplines and takes on the age-old questions of why be good and can we find ways to be better at getting along with each other. His hipster humor will calm the nerves of many a science phobe. Consider the chapter that is entitled Adolescence, or Dude, Where's My Frontal Cortex? He informs us and he challenges us and has written the kind of accessible yet serious science that was envisioned 60 years ago when the Phi Beta Kappa Award in Science was established. Robert Sapolsky is the John A. and Cynthia Fry Gunn Professor of Biological Sciences at Stanford University and Professor of Neurology and Neurosurgery at Stanford's School of Medicine. He's also a research associate at the Institute of Primate Research operated by the National Museums of Kenya in Nairobi. He is a recipient of a MacArthur Genius Fellowship. His teaching awards include Stanford's University Bing Award for Teaching Excellence and an award for outstanding teaching from the Associated Students of Stanford University. Now, unfortunately, Bob could not be here tonight. He has a very good reason for not being here. His daughter is in a play in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at a school that some of us used to refer to as the H School. So he is absent with leave, but we are very fortunate in his stead to have our colleague Greg Petsko joining us this evening. Greg Petsko has served as a member of the Phi Beta Kappa Award for Science Selection Panel for over 6 years and has recently joined the Visiting Scholar Committee. He is a professor emeritus of biochemistry at Brandeis University, where we were colleagues, about which more in a moment, and he holds the Arthur J. Mahan Professor of Neurology and Neuroscience at Weill Cornell Medical College. He has been a leader in protein and structural biology for over 3 decades, pursuing groundbreaking research not only on how proteins work, but on how they are related to causes of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's and other plagues of our time. Greg, I can tell you, as my former colleague, is what is rare in the academy and known as the bona fide triple threat. If you find someone who is a nationally recognized, internationally recognized scholar, and a passable teacher and an adequate community servant, you've got a good, solid member of your faculty. If you find somebody who's an internationally recognized scholar and an outstanding teacher, you almost don't care what else he does for the community. But when you find somebody who does those 2 things and, well, let me give you an example. It usually involves a donor, doesn't it, Lynn? I had a donor visiting Brandeis with no prior connection with the university. 2 things these people were interested in: art and neuroscience. So I was able to get somebody to open the Rose Art Museum up for them so they could have a private tour of the collection. That was easy. But who among my science colleagues could I impose on a Sunday afternoon to do this? Honest to God, I don't think I finished the sentence before Petsko said to me, what time and where? And afterwards they said, it's a lovely museum, but Dr. Petsko. So I am delighted to ask on behalf of Dr. Sapolsky for some words to be shared by my friend and colleague, Dr. Greg Petsko.
So I asked Robert, whom I know, to send me something that I could read to you because I thought it would be better for you to hear his words rather than mine. And he was kind enough to do so. Unfortunately, you get me during the question and answer period, but I can't do anything about that. So these are his words now. A behavior occurs, and you ask a very human question. Why did that person do that? Why did he mistake the guy's cell phone for a handgun and shoot him? Why did she donate a kidney to a total stranger? Why did he run into the burning building to save someone else's child? Why did she belch in the middle of the eulogy and didn't even seem embarrassed? My book's premise is the fact that these are all biological questions. What is the biological mechanism that explains why that behavior occurs? We are biological organisms: apes, primates, mammals, vertebrates. Our nervous systems are made of the same building blocks as a fly. They use the same chemical messengers, too. We have orders of magnitude more neurons than a fly does, at least some people do. And with enough, we are in Washington, and with enough quantity, we invent quality. But we are nothing more or less than the same biological stuff that constitutes every organism. Now that it's all biological can tempt you to simplify down to single causes, to conclude that this gene explains everything about some behavior, or this hormone does, or this neurotransmitter does, or this pressure from evolution. If you take that approach, you will understand nothing. Something different is needed. A behavior occurs that is wonderful, horrible, or ambiguously in between, and you wonder why it happened. What you are asking is what happened in that individual's nervous system a second before that commanded those muscles to produce that behavior. But crucially, you're also asking what environment stimuli in the previous seconds to minutes prompted that nervous system to produce that behavior. And you're also asking what hormones in the previous hours today changed that nervous system's sensitivity to those stimuli. And from there, you're off and running because you've got to know what did weeks to months of neural plasticity have to do with the structure of the nervous system at that moment. What about adolescence, childhood, fetal life? What genes made those behaviors more or less likely in those circumstances? And then, even further back, what culture did that person's ancestors invent? Because that will influence that person's upbringing from the moment they were born. What ecosystem produced that culture? And how did many millions of years of evolution help sculpt this species? In other words, the punchline of my nearly 800-page book is, it's complicated. Now you don't have to read it. It's complicated, and you'd better be damned cautious in deciding you understand why a behavior occurred, especially when you're judged harshly. After the first half of the book covers the 1 second before the behavior to a million years before the behavior approach, it examines what all this means for the dichotomy between us versus them, for hierarchy and obedience, for moral decision-making, for empathy and compassion, for the criminal justice system and our notions of free will, and for the human capacity to change in ways that can be spectacular and inspiring. In other words, not only are we biologically complicated, but understanding these complications matters. You're all behavioral biologists. That's implicitly true every time you serve on a jury, vote for a referendum as to whether a societal problem can be fixed with a government expenditure, decide whether to yell at your teenager because they've done something impulsive, decide whether a loved one is suffering from the biochemical disorder we call depression, or if they're just in a funk. We're all behavioral biologists, and the book's goal is to make people more informed behavioral biologists. And thus, in the hopes of that happening, I thank Phi Beta Kappa for the huge honor of liking the book and giving it its really wonderful stamp of approval. Thank you deeply.
Now, I should just add that in terms of questions you might want to ask, Greg, having served on the panel that selected Behave as the prize winner, has graciously agreed to take questions in Sapolsky's place on Behave, but he's also happy to talk about his own work, the process of the book selection process, if you like, and as Greg told me offline, you don't mind my sharing it with 100 of my close friends here. He said, if I don't know the answer, I'll just make it up, so don't worry about it. I told him I was counting on it. Last, no means least, the Ralph Waldo Emerson Award. We claim Emerson, not a member of Phi Beta Kappa, by the way, but we claim Emerson for, of course, having delivered the extraordinary American Scholar lecture from which our magazine takes its name and from which all of us take inspiration, even now, all these years later. The Ralph Waldo Emerson Award was established in 1960 to recognize studies that contribute significantly to historical, philosophical, or religious interpretations of the human condition. The winner of the 2018 Phi Beta Kappa Ralph Waldo Emerson Award is Greater Gotham, A History of New York City from 1898 to 1919 by Mike Wallace, published by Oxford University Press. Greater Gotham, all 1,000+ pages of it, that doesn't include the index, is the sequel to the Pulitzer Prize-winning Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898. Picking up the story with the creation of the modern New York City in 1898 with the consolidation of the then city of New York, Manhattan and the Bronx, with the independent city of Brooklyn, and the rural hinterlands of Queens and Staten Island. Well, Staten Island is still rural hinterlands. It carries the story forward 2 decades through the end of the First World War. Contains all the drama, passion, excitement, fear, noise, and energy of turn of the last century New York, and it is beautifully written to boot. It would be intimidating in its comprehensiveness were it not for Wallace's extraordinary ability to wear his erudition lightly. It is both almost encyclopedic in its scope and yet readable, a rare combination. But he leaves us in 1919. So that leaves me to challenge Mike with his own words. At the end of Greater Gotham, he summarizes the new city's ability to handle the enormous strains and stresses of its first 2 decades. He says, a cautious observer in 1920 might well have been prepared to say, so far, so good. So 2 volumes in, Mike, we say, so far, so good. Mike Wallace is the Distinguished Professor of History at John Jay College of Criminal Justice of the University of New York, where he has taught since 1971. He is also founder of the Gotham Center for New York City History at the CUNY Graduate School, devoted to the study and popular promotion of the history of New York City. As mentioned, he has won the Pulitzer Prize for History for Gotham, and now I am delighted to say the Ralph Waldo Emerson Prize for his magisterial sequel, Greater Gotham. Mike Wallace.
I want to begin by thanking the Phi Beta Kappa Society for awarding me the Emerson Prize. It is a great honor to be associated with such a vibrant and vigorous, yet ancient American institution. Now, a bit of full disclosure. I myself was not inducted into PBK membership during my college days at Columbia, 1960 to 64, a judgment with which I completely concur. I floundered about as an undergraduate, partly because I was a pre-med, my mother having convinced me that in the next depression I'd be assured of continuing employment. But medicine was a profession for which I had no aptitude. In fact, I nearly failed organic chemistry. Only late in my college career did I learn that history, which I'd been studying for fun, could in fact be a way of earning a living. Even better, it appeared that history, as well as the other liberal arts and social sciences, could be a way of improving the world as well as surviving in it. It was, after all, the 60s. In due course, I became part of a movement of young scholars who set about rewriting the traditional narrative of the country's past, in tandem with a variety of social movements that were busily rewriting its present. The dominant account bequeathed by the 40s and 50s generation tended to emphasize political, economic, and military history, to focus on elites, and to downplay conflict and privilege consensus. But the insurgent campaigns of blacks, women, gays, workers, and immigrants highlighted the paucity of studies that focused on what was, after all, the vast majority of the population. The response in the 60s and 70s and 80s was a torrent of new scholarship, advanced in books, dissertations, and journals. Collectively, the new work constituted a national narrative that was more complex, more inclusive, more sensitive to conflict and change. My first contribution to this new body of work, an article called The Uses of Violence in American History, was published in 1971 in Phi Beta Kappa's American Scholar. By the late 70s, I was convinced that the flood of scholarship had collectively rewritten the national story in pieces, but still lacked an overarching presentation accessible to the public. This concern for popular outreach was yet another dimension of my generation's project, which set about taking history out of the cloisters and into the public sphere. I participated in the making of museum exhibitions, documentary and feature films, theme parks, historic reconstructions, historic preservation sites, and memorials, and by writing essays about ways that the past was getting presented or misrepresented in popular culture. Eventually, I collected these in a book called Mickey Mouse History. But my principal goal was to present an alternative narrative in textual form. In the late 70s, I recruited Ted Burroughs, a friend and colleague, and we, rather foolhardily, set out to write a multi-volume history of the United States. After working for several years, we had not gotten out of the 17th century. Realizing that we'd need 11 lifetimes but had only 2 to spare, we decided to reformulate the project and tell the country's larger story through the medium of New York City. This led to the 1999 publication of Gotham, which covered the period from the Ice Age to 1898, a 1,400-page doorstopper whose Amazon audio tape runs 67 hours and 35 minutes. And last year, I brought out Greater Gotham, a 1,200-page sequel carrying the story down to the end of the First World War, the book you are honoring today. Both volumes and the still in progress Volume 3 are syntheses of the work produced by historians in specialized domains, economic, social, cultural, political, and focused on a great variety of historical actors whose stories are told and woven into a text that, to the best of my ability, approximates a novel. The most gratifying thing critics have said is that they find the books, despite their gargantuan girth, not just accessible, but enjoyable. And the most satisfying certification of the worthiness of such a project is the accolade being given today to Greater Gotham by a society whose aims and accomplishments so closely mirror my own. Thank you.
Congratulations again to all our recipients.
We have questions that have been collected, will be asked from the people who wrote them on the cards, but I get the prerogative of the chair to start with one for each of you. Well, let's go in the order in which the prizes were awarded. That seems simplest. So Laura, you said you wanted to write a Thoreau for our times, sort of bring him to life in our times. You must have, and just from your footnotes, I know you have, deeply engaged with the not only deep literature of Thoreau's life, but your predecessor biographers of him. So how do you think of yourself as part of a ongoing project of biographies of Henry David Thoreau over the decades, over the years?
Okay, that's a great question. So I'm in good company here with an Emerson quote about each age has to write its own books. And I think if you look at the kind of canonical figures or iconic figures or even figures that are being lifted into recognition, it is part of the job of scholarship to assess and continue to reassess in a really in sort of challenging way the figures that continue to move them forward in time with us. So they're going to shift in meaning. The Thoreau of the 1930s is not necessarily the Thoreau of today, although there's some interesting similarities, but the Thoreau of other eras shifts from the person who seems to be relevant to us today. And I really felt that the sort of big significant biography I grew up with was Walter Harding's in 1965. And I started school at the high theory moment of the 80s. Well, that was a tough time for Thoreau, right? But at the same time, it was a wonderful time because this was the moment of feminism, of the new historicism, of social movements, and we were discovering black writers, and suddenly people were looking at slavery and the questions of the meaning, what led to the Civil War, and the meaning of the Civil War. And I thought, what a fantastic time to reassess Thoreau, because none of this had yet been sort of incorporated into the narrative. So I tried to sort of bring all of that on board without being, I mean, you can't lecture about any part of it, but somehow that it would all be incorporated and folded into to create. And I felt very happy that it gave me a kind of purchase. I didn't have to work at creating a new Thoreau. He was just there, speaking to us, but in these new ways.
Well, I'm so tempted to follow up, but that's not going to be fair to others.
Yeah.
So I said I got one question to each. Tell you a trial lawyer's trick. They teach you never, ever say, just two more questions, Your Honor. You say, a brief redirect, Your Honor, because you're never sure you're going to want to live. May I ask two questions? And the judge, of course, says, what's your second? Let that sink in there for a second. Okay. So, Greg, in Robert's work and or your work, I mean, one of the things that's so extraordinary to me in Behave is what I take to be solid science. I'm not in a position to assess that, but I take it to be solid science. But it is accessible, and it appears to be pitched to what the Times Book Review and the American Scholar likes to call the serious general reader, right, Bob? The serious general reader, but also to a certain kind of specialist. But when we actually turn to science research, how do you write both science and for the serious general reader?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that make it hard. One is that in the ordinary discourse that scientists have with one another, they use jargon. And they do this they do it partly as a reason for seeming smarter than they are, but mostly they do it because it's simply economical. It makes it easier to have complex discussions with fewer words. You have to eschew jargon almost completely. And on those occasions where it's necessary to use it, you have to define it very carefully, realizing that jargon is often built on jargon, and therefore defining it gets to be a complex pyramidal process. So keeping that in mind is critical. But I think and Robert does that quite well, although he doesn't eschew it, but he does define it. But I think what he does do even better, and what I think is essential, is to tell stories. We all like to be told stories, and some of the most interesting stories in the world are about ourselves, about what we are as people, as human animals, if you will. And Robert knows those stories and tells them brilliantly. And I think this is the secret in teaching science as well. If you're trying to teach science to non-scientists, you have to do it in the context of being a storyteller. If you can do that, it'll work.
So, Mike, in a way, we have two biographies we're honoring. You, in a way, have written a 1,000-plus page, or now 2,000-plus pages, two-volume biography of the city of New York. I was always told that the best descriptive work has got a prescriptive payoff, a normative payoff somewhere. Do you think there's a normative payoff in your biography of New York?
Well, I would hope so. Now, this lays out a trajectory that enables you to, or calls your attention to similar questions in the present. Where are we now? Where might we be going? Another one is the shifting macroeconomic basis of the city. Why don't it keep alive? And it goes from being a colonial seaport, thriving on trade with the Caribbean islands, to being a manufacturing center, to being a financial center, to being et cetera, et cetera. And again, understanding that the present is flexible, that the moment you're in is part of a chain, a series of events, and it alerts you to the tyranny of the present. I mean, if you don't understand the historical flow of things, if you don't understand how the present got to be the way it is, then you're vulnerable to all kinds of misconceptions. You're trapped on the surface of things. So in addition to telling a biography, a story of millions of people's, I tried to build a sequence of events that focus your attention on asking where we stand in the present in regard to those trends and tendencies. That's, if you will, it's almost un-American to say history counts to such a degree, but I believe it does. I think knowing that connection between past and present is a source of power and is to be encouraged. The past is not dead, as has been said repeatedly incorrectly.
Very nice. Our first question.
Well, of course, it's a question for Laura because we're in the same field, and I was very moved by your book.
Thank you.
And there's so many questions I want to ask, but I'll limit it to one, which is really a comparative question about Emerson versus Thoreau, or Thoreau versus Emerson. It's a question that is an intersection of politics, religion, and philosophy. And, you know, your Thoreau is a man who takes in multitudes, who embraces, you know, the poor worker, the slave, et cetera, et cetera. He's very anti-materialistic in a spiritual way. Whereas his friend Emerson is what some scholars have called the imperial self. He's hyper-individualistic. So how do you compare and contrast, and do we worry, of course, that Emerson was misappropriated in the Gilded Age by the robber barons and those who rode with his materialism, with his individualism, and turned it to materialism?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a debate going on in transcendentalism studies more broadly about whether we lay the kind of Gilded Age materialistic individualism in some fashion at the doorstep of the transcendentalists, the kind of, you know, my imperial self deserves to reach out and appropriate the universe. And I think that formation is there before the transcendentalists come into being. And so it feeds into the kind of appropriation of them. And you see this especially with Emerson, because he's the one who gets the sort of biggest currency in post-Civil War America. This is the low point for Thoreau. He's there, but he's seen as a minor writer until the century's end. But Emerson is always the major. You have to deal with Emerson, no matter who you are. So, yeah, and the Thoreau that I started to think about in terms of the contrast with Emerson. There's an interesting moment when I found a William James essay quite recently where he's obviously addressing himself with his godfather Emerson, thinking about the total appropriation of the world, sort of absolutist idealism, where the individual writ largest, as versus the pluralist, and here's the Jamesian sense of plurality. And what the word that struck me as typical Jamesian that was diagnostic for Thoreau was affection. Thoreau has this affection for the world, for the being of the world, for the particulars of the world, for the smallest ways and aspects of the world. And James would say it's temperament. You don't get that affection in Emerson. You get lots of other things that are very interesting, but not this sort of descent into the sort of minor beauties of life and the creaturely world, the felt sensory world. And I think that somehow tips them in different directions, even though their philosophy has so many things in common. They end up coming out with different flavors of it. But in Thoreau's case, the individualism is meant to model what each of us could be, but always in a community setting. And that's what's usually lost in the kind of stereotypical account, because he thinks that in New England you don't need to fight for that, it's built in. The community is always there. He's part of a community. He assumes that that's the reality of how people deal with each other. We can't do that anymore. We have to build communities and save them, capture them before they collapse. Thoreau started to become aware of that after Walden. That's where a lot of his late writing goes, and that's part of the story the biography wants to tell.
Next question.
This question is for Mr. Wallace. First off, I just want to say, as a lifelong New Yorker, I appreciate how much your books have made our great city come to life in a wonderful way, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
So my question is, if you could choose an event or an individual you feel had the greatest impact on New York's history, who or what might that be? For good or bad?
It depends on which New York we're talking about, it's such a mutable place that New York in one century and New York in another century are dramatically different. So the two who come to mind are DeWitt Clinton and the building of the Erie Canal, and J.P. Morgan, although one could add John D. Rockefeller and a host of others, who consolidated the American economy and went a long way towards consolidating New York City. The end of the Revolution and the success of breaking with Great Britain was wonderful and hailed and all that, but the question was, now what in international affairs? And Great Britain had no interest in bolstering the economy of the new fledgling United States. But inadvertently, they came to the country's rescue. With the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, and textiles, they needed two things from North America. One was cotton for the mills, two was food for the workers. So the three most dynamic economic areas in that time were Manchester, the old Northwest, and the South. And the question was, what was going to be the linking agent? And if you looked at the geography of the country, New Orleans was placed to become the critical link between Europe and the United States because of the river system that ran down and because New York City was isolated from the interior of the continent by the Appalachian Mountain chain. But there was a break in the Appalachian Mountain chain just a bit the level of where Buffalo is now. And what DeWitt Clinton, mayor, governor, presidential candidate, etc., but a powerful political persuasive force, was able to do was to get the city to commit to following the line of the Hudson River. You get to Albany, you make a left turn, there was the Mohawk River with scattered bits of things. But then they dug the biggest construction project in history virtually at that point in the game. And this allowed New York to connect with the Great Lakes system and to go all the way as far as Fort Dearborn, which became Chicago. This meant that the city was the dynamic sector between these three zones, and that it would be the source of capital flowing from Europe, immigrants to work in the mines, fields, factories, and mid-country cities, cultural imports, etc. It also became a manufacturing center to service this flow of goods and a banking center to... So in innumerable ways, the New York City was revolutionized in the 1820s and the 1830s. Everything begins to sort of draw down to New York City. And that's largely the length and shadow of one man. The Morgan story is another story and takes too long to...
Question in the back.
Yes, question for Dr. Petsko, actually. Dan Rosenberg, I volunteer with the DC PBK Association. And this is more of a concrete question about the book, but in the book, what are some of the most influential factors in determining behaviors under what circumstances?
You do remember the book is 800 pages long. So, and I get the sense you're actually trying to avoid reading it, which is the point of the question. But, so let me see if I can touch on a couple. There are too many to list without discussing them, but there are a couple that stand out for me, I think. So one is the pleasure system of the brain. It produces a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine is important for people's experiences of reward and satisfaction. It's a chemical that's released during sexual intercourse, for example, and many other things that bring pleasure, eating, and so forth. And what seems to happen is that there are social events and behavioral situations that are quite different from the very primitive things of eating and reproduction that also clearly trigger this system, the limbic system in the brain, to produce dopamine and respond to it. And among these are the feeling of belonging to a group, which gives a biological imperative for the establishment of hierarchies and conforming behavior. Another thing that triggers this kind of effect is disappointment. If you expect a particular kind of reward or a particular event to occur, and it doesn't occur at all, or it doesn't occur in the magnitude you expect, then you can experience a loss of a dopamine sensation. Whereas if it occurs in a magnitude greater than you expect, then you can experience an increase in dopamine, and this reinforces certain types of behavior and certain types of attitude. So this is one of the things he spends quite a bit of time on, and I think is fairly persuasive. There are other things, too, having to do with the ability of the brain to adapt. He refers to it as plasticity, but the fact that we can learn, we can make new neural connections, and that these not only occur in response to injury, but in other activities as well. So those things are important. And then he talks about the fact that a lot of this has an evolutionary underpinning, which is to say behavior that leads to our being able to survive in stressful situations or mate more effectively and reproduce more frequently gets built into the human genome and carried on in future generations. And so cultural norms, in addition to this underlying biology, are self-reinforcing. I think that's as far as I probably want to go in trying to summarize even part of the book. There's a lot more to it than that, but those are examples of ways in which I think he makes pretty good sense out of things we're all familiar with in terms of how we behave at a level that we usually don't think about them.
Okay, this is an anonymous question, not from my wife. But also, Laura, this is for you. A short one. You say that Thoreau scolds. What would he most scold us for today?
Oh, wow. Well, I think he'd have a lot of concerns, but I think what... oh my God.
Still pretty frosted about the Mexican-American War, I suspect.
No, I think he'd say, he would look at what's happening to the planet, and it really goes to the quote I used in the talk about what is the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on, and he would say, all the other things that need to be attended to do need to be attended to, but we must, absolutely must, be talking about global warming. We have to be addressing climate change and all the other elements of the Anthropocene or I'm thinking about biodiversity as probably the one that he would be personally most acutely aware of. So I have a colleague in the sciences who's been looking at the species composition at Walden Pond using Thoreau's records, because this is Richard Primack at Boston University. Thanks to Thoreau, we have exact records of what plants were where and when they bloomed. And the shocking news is that even in this temperate part of the United States, the only thing that accounts for the change in species composition is global warming, and the composition is, we're down to something like a third of the plant species that Thoreau knew and loved. And he would look at this and say that we're allowing this to happen is a form of insanity. That we didn't stop it 30 or 40 years ago, that we're still not acting sufficiently to slow global warming. He would say it truly is a systemic form of insanity and extraordinarily dangerous and destructive. So I think he'd be out sounding the alarm on that, with full attention to the way that other social aspects of the world are also degrading. But he would also point our attention to the way in which that degradation is part of this larger picture, too.
Some might say that New York is exceptional, not typical of the American experience. So why tell the story of the U.S. through the story of New York, as opposed to some other place, Chicago, for example?
Well,
No animus against Chicago implied. Well, it's not that New York is typical. In fact, I think it's correct to say that it's atypical, or it has been for much of its history. It's an interesting question as to how that atypicality is faring in today's homogenization, but it's the tension, in fact, between New York and the rest of the country that is interesting. And you can't look at New York in isolation, and you can't look at the rest of the country in isolation, because they're locked in an embrace. Depends on what that is, what particular time we're talking about. So in the 1920s, for instance, there was a concerted, vigorous belief that New York was, in fact, the antithesis of America, that it was a European adjunct. It was full of the wrong kinds of people. There was blacks, there was Jews, there was Italians, there was people who were interested in drinking instead of prohibiting drinking.
Sounds like my hometown.
And it was corrupt. It was Tammany Hall. It was everything bad you can imagine. And yet, there was this fascination with New York. The jazz music that was pouring over the new national radio networks emanating from New York. Henry Ford was appalled at this black music, in essence, infecting the good. We should get back to square dancing and folk music and stuff like that. And seeing life as a culture battle, but also between Wall Street and the rest of the country. The agricultural sector was in terrible shape. In the 20s, an unreal amount of speculation was driving the ersatz economy to dangerous levels, which in fact soon imploded. So you have to think of the appeal of New York. I mean, farmers' daughters in Wyoming were dressing up like Clara Bow and kissing like they saw in the movies. There's always been this tradition in the United States literary world of let's destroy New York City, and imagining it blown to bits, succumbing to internal revolution, etc. They're on each other's minds, and the real dynamic power relationships they count. And so it's not that I'm imagining that New York is typical and representative in some way. It's that it's this powerful force that exerts a magnetic pull and also repels at the same time. And it's this dance that I'm interested in.
Hi, I'm John Harkless. I'm a brand new senator, chemistry faculty at Howard. This question's for Dr. Petsko. Humans develop tools from hammers to CRISPR and then use them in ethical and unethical ways. Does brain science help us understand this constant in human behavior?
It's a wonderful question. I think, let me speak personally first. You read about this scientist in China who claims to have used a technique called CRISPR. It's a gene editing technique, that's all you need to know about it, to edit the genomes of 2 unborn children so that they were born without a particular gene that codes for a protein that the AIDS virus uses to enter cells. I think that scientist, if he really did this, and there's some question about that, but if this scientist really did this, he should be in prison. Okay, not in jail. Jail's where you go while you wait to go to prison. He should be in prison. But that being said, okay, the trouble, as you know, with all technology is that once the genie gets out of the bottle, you can't put it back in. So this stuff's going to get used some way or other, and the specter of eugenics, which has come and gone in civilization for quite some time, is going to get raised again. And what does this have to do with what Robert writes about in his book? I think the answer is it has a fair amount to do. So one of the things he does discuss is this us versus them business. This feeling that we want to belong to a group, but we don't just want to belong to a group, we want that group to be superior to the other group or groups. And there is a powerful dopaminergic stimulation that comes from this, and that stimulation reinforces the kind of behavior that leads to a Manichaean view of the world, good versus evil, us versus them. And I think that's one of the things that's going to make it very tough to keep people from making use of technology like this, because there's going to be a strong social drive to try to do that. And this is one reason that scientists should not be the ones to make decisions about what technology gets used and how it gets used. This is a job for the whole human species, and we need input from every discipline, especially the other disciplines that are sitting up here, ranging from religion to philosophy to all kinds of other things. And what bothers me is the likelihood that, driven by other natural human desires, which is the desire for success and approbation, that scientists may decide to do something with this without letting the public weigh in. I don't think that'll happen in this country. At least I hope it won't happen in this country, but that it'll happen somewhere else, unfortunately, I fear it very likely. I don't know if that's the answer you were hoping for or looking for, but that's an honest one.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay. I'm John Pope. This is a question for Dr. Walls. There has been so much written about Henry David Thoreau over the years. In your research, what did you find about Henry David Thoreau that surprised you?
I think probably the biggest surprise, I sort of saw it coming, but once I got into the records, it still surprised me, was how very interesting the women in his family were. I mean, in the traditional biography, you know, he's the show and they're very much wallpaper, or maybe even worse. And unfortunately, his sister burned a lot of the family records when she was quite elderly. She thought it was her duty. She was the last surviving member of the family, and it's sort of like she didn't want to do it, but it's what you did out of privacy concerns. And this is terrible if you're a biographer or a historian. So there's many things we don't know, including a lot of the kind of texture of the lives of, he had 2 sisters. he was close to his eldest sister was a kind of, I don't know, she was an anti-slavery activist and a kind of moral center that he looked up to. His little sister was, people said she's Henry without skirts. And they would pal around together. His mother was a strong activist and outspoken fighter for social justice who, joined good causes. And then he had aunts, and it's I mean, it's huge circles of family. And to realize that his sense of what the good life was and what an important life could be was guided by these very strong, very outgoing, very well-educated and thoughtful and feisty and outspoken women, was like, where has that story been all our lives? And so I tried to really bring them in and show that this really truly was a kind of collaborative household. And he was part of this collaboration. They looked to him, he looked to them. And they were a kind of collective household that participated in town affairs. And that's the other side of it. It wasn't just the household, but all the involvement in the community, the town of Concord. And so all of that side kind of, it's there in the records, but it wasn't there in the way that we thought of the story. Partly because we've kind of got the fictional author of the narrator of Walden mixed up with the actual historical person. So they're deeply related, but the whole person is much bigger than the narrator of Walden.
My name is Michael Lubin. I'm from Atlanta. This is for Dr. Petsko. And this would be a yes or a no answer, but I'd like you to be a little broader than that.
My client is incapable of just a yes or no answer.
No.
Does Dr. Sapolsky or you believe in free will?
Oh.
Well, I did until the presidential election of 2016. I do believe in free will. I think Robert believes in free will. But I think both of us understand from biology that to exercise free will in some circumstances is not easy. And it requires a tremendous desire on our parts to be something other than what we are often constraining ourselves to be.
Last question of the evening, Jean Howard.
Hi, this is for Mr. Wallace. I'm afraid I can't see you very well over the podium, but I hope you can hear. My question is, everything's still so far so good in New York City. That is, how does the city of 2018 stack up against the city of 1920, which is approximately when you ended this volume?
Well, that phrase was based on the specific situation that at the beginning of this volume, the city comes together, the two greatest cities in the country, New York and Brooklyn in terms of population, merge with the outer boroughs as well, and the Colossus is born, but it's composed of many different peoples. And one of the plus points about the ensuing 20 years is that although there were tremendous internal conflicts along race lines, along class lines, along gender lines, political divisions, nobody is talking about, okay, let's pack it in and dismantle this and disaggregate the city. There were legitimate complaints about the consolidation movement and the size of everything, and but it didn't fly apart. But if the question is how to compare the 20s with the contemporary city, it's a troubling moment, I think. I mean, when you think of the 20s, it's a colossal speculative binge that eventually unhinged the whole national and arguably global economy. I'm not knowledgeable enough to say that the straws floating in the wind are proof positive of an imminent cardiac arrest of the financial system. But it's a troubling moment because in some sense, this has repeated itself over and over and over again. A speculative binge, a collapse, a reconstruction, imposition of rules to tighten the financial sector's autonomy, then the loosening of those bonds, and another speculative binge, and we're off and running again. So there's nerve-wracking comparisons. The other is conceivably more hopeful, that the 1920s, partly because of this country-city division, but aided by forces inside the city, imposed restrictions on immigration, draconian ones that changed the balance of the demographic balance of the city. In 1921, 1924, the eugenics movement was sort of powering the argument that the racial component of the city and the country was being polluted by the wrong kinds of people, namely Italians and Jews and Southern blacks and Caribbean blacks. So there was a clampdown, and it affected New York City profoundly. We're living in an age which still boasts the reversal of that policy. It started in 1965 and 1980 reforms. And so we have this multinational, multi-ethnic cultural base. In the 1910s, there was the emergence for the first time of philosophers, Horace Callen, John Dewey, Randolph, Bourne, who argued that the fact of multinationality and multilinguistics was in fact not something to fret about, but was, if unplanned for, was a colossal boon, because nowhere on earth had there been such a constellation and conglomeration of peoples, and this was a resource that should be built on. They lost. History can go backwards. It's one of the lessons of this. They lost, and their voice was crushed until arguably the 30s. Boasian cultural anthropology restores that Franklin Roosevelt took up the notion of good to have a variegated population. But we live again in a moment where on the one hand New York is more complex than it's ever been, but is threatened by new revanchist forces that would seek to stifle the influx of multiple populations. And while I did say that understanding history gives you a leg up on understanding what forces are at work in the present and how to maneuver accordingly, it doesn't guarantee anything. So that rest is up to us.
I can't think of a more powerful way to conclude our presentation. Please join me in thanking, congratulating our panelists.